My father leaned forward, his mighty horns brushing against the nearby trees. The velvet shimmer of his short black fur cast a dancing sheen of the evening sunlight across his marvelous body. He breathed in slowly, deeply. The wind, which came racing along the mountains and caressed his forest, flowed steadily into him. The fortitude of life was his alone in that moment. His emerald eyes narrowed before he cast his gaze upon me. He spoke to me with an earth-rattling gravitas, and the whispering of the forest animals stopped to heed their king's words. Soon a day will come where I decay, and the madness will corrupt me, as it does all our kin. When that day comes, you will need to make a choice, my cub. He then quietly arose, standing tall and strong like a great hemlock. These lands have been cleansed and blessed by the blood of our family time and time again, as kin have killed their father. He began to stride forward, and I quickly hopped off my rock to join him by his side. My father continued to speak. You will have to kill me, and when I die, so too will a part of you. You will lose an innocence that can only be given once and never earned back. But I don't want to kill you, I whispered, my voice trembling and was barely audible over the rustling brush. The very thought of it sunk its fangs deep into my heart. My father stopped and turned toward me. The rock sunk into the moist earth beneath his feet. That is a choice you must make, even though it will be painful. He lowered his head, and his eyes locked onto mine. Beautiful accents of gold raced through his eyes, and then he touched his soft snout to my forehead. The hardest battles are the ones we have yet to face. The breath of his words wrapped around the thorns of my mind, dulling their unwanted sting. My father bowed his head, lowering his horns to the ground in front of me. Get on, child, he beckoned. I climbed up my father's side and came to rest upon his shoulders, holding onto his antlers. He slowly lifted his head and me high into the brisk air to be bathed in the setting western sun. Night was fast approaching as my father continued to lead us across the moss-laden earth. Shadows stretched and twisted, merging into a single dark mass. My father moved silently, his black fur blending into the darkness. Only the glow of his eyes, reflecting the moonlight, and the glint of his sharp white teeth betrayed his presence. The earth soon brought a chill, carrying with it the scents of pine and dew. My father made barely a sound as he moved. Each step was light and deliberate, as though the forest itself shifted to accommodate his passage. Where are we going? I asked. To a place that remembers, he answered simply, not looking back. A shallow mist cautiously rose from its slumber, drifting upwards but still hugging the forest floor. My father's footsteps sent delicate swirls to dance alone in the fog. I watched the spirals be birthed from nothing, live their brief moment of grace, and then return themselves to the whole once more. I then listened to the emerging whispers and murmurs all around us. Tiny voices crawled forth from the smallest cracks and darkest crevices, a melody that was orchestrated by the march of the night. The chirps and the calls echoed in the boundless expanse. The rise and fall of my father's shoulders as he breathed became the pulse of the night, a rhythm steady and strong. With each deep inhale, the mist seemed to draw closer, wrapping tighter around us. And with each exhale, it loosened and drifted away, like the tide ebbing and flowing against the shore. I felt myself drifting too, becoming weightless and untethered, lulled by the gentle cadence of his breaths. My eyes fluttered shut, and I slipped into a place between waking and dreaming, where the boundary between myself and the forest blurred and disappeared altogether. The edges of my awareness began to wash away, and I felt as though I began to lift, to drift upwards. I moved outwards, and my being felt at peace. I moved through the membranes of the forest as a spirit, feeling the heartbeat of time pull me forward, further away. Soon I encroached upon a budding darkness, but I did not feel fear. My body materialized at the edge of the abyss, and I stood upright, alone. An ethereal glow bloomed from the nearby dream lilies, and the air hummed with a power that I can only describe now as complete. I turned back toward the abyss for a moment, feeling like I was deep underwater. My vision shifted back, and I was in the presence of the past guardians. And they did not speak, not at first, but their presence filled the space between us. I felt their gaze like the weight of the forest itself, pressing gently yet firmly, urging me to look deeper, to see beyond what was merely visible. My breath caught, and I glanced around, searching for my father. He was nowhere to be seen. A soft murmur rose up, a ripple in the silence, and the guardian's eyes shifted, each one reflecting something different. I saw in their eyes scenes of the forest's bloom, of fire, of storms that tore through the canopy, of creatures both small and great falling and rising again. "Do you know why you're here?" one of them whispered, sounding like the rustle of wind through dry leaves. A figure stepped forward, its antlers gleaming with a soft, golden light. "Not yet," it said quietly, "but you will." The others shifted, and I could feel the weight of countless seasons, of every breath and every heartbeat they had ever taken, layering themselves over me. The air grew thick, and I struggled to keep myself upright. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to stand tall under their scrutiny. Visions of millions of years of growth flashed before my eyes. I watched the first fingers of my home break the soil as they began on a journey to craft everything we've ever known. I watched the first creatures emerge from the water's edge, and as more crawled and slithered from beneath the rocks, I watched the first predator take a life, and I watched that predator die of old age, only to be consumed by that which it once ate. I watched as fires and floods brought my home to the precipice of existence, and I saw the forest recover time and time again. I saw the beauty of my home. I saw the majesty of my forest. I saw the owl and the mouse and the fox and the rabbit, the raccoon and her precious young. I saw everything I came to love. And then I saw him, my father, or what was left of him. He was hunched over on all fours, looming like a broken shadow over the mangled remains of forest creatures. His breaths came in harsh, ragged gasps. His once glorious fur now clumped upon his ruined body. It clung to him in filthy, matted patches. Deep gashes crisscrossed his form, crimson crevices cutting through his hide like lightning cuts the sky. Every streak leaked blood that soaked into the greedy earth. His fangs, sharp and stained, bared in a twisted snarl. Dark red saliva dripped in slow, viscous trails from his maw. The regal antlers that had once crowned him as a symbol of authority were reduced to charred, crumbling remnants, blackened and brittle as if burned from the inside out. His eyes, once shimmering pools of emerald and gold, were now clouded over, a wild, frenzied gray that saw nothing, recognized nothing. "Father!" The word slipped from my mouth before I could catch it, my voice breaking through the silence like shattering glass. His head snapped up, and the air around him seemed to ripple. For an agonizing second, those vacant eyes locked onto me, and then he moved, sudden and violent. He charged at me with the force he used to raise mountains. The very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of his fury. His mouth yawned open, wider and wider until it stretched beyond the limits of flesh and bone. The jaw unhinged as it opened so wide that the entire shape of his head folded back, and I could see the hollow darkness of his inner throat. He was close enough that I could feel the heat of his breath and the sickening stench of decay mixed with the blood of all the things I had once loved. Deep in the void of the throat, 2 shimmering emeralds cloaked in gold pushed forth. The wet face of my father twisted and writhed its way through the throat, stopping just halfway up. My father's voice, small and weak, barely managed to escape from deep within the decaying throat. Stop me when it is time, or this is what I will become. Hearing him like this, so diminished, sent a shiver down my spine and set a sorrow deep in my bones. Father, His gaping jaws snapped shut. I awoke with a burning fear, sitting upright and panting heavily. The world stayed cloaked in a dreamlike haze. The earth around me felt different now, the ephemeral connection between worlds growing and fading and growing again as the events of the dream weaved their images once more in my mind. Do you understand now, cub? My father spoke in a slow and tired tone that matched my reverie. He laid next to me. The break of dawn was upon us, and we sat on the edge of a Goliath cliff that rose far above our home. I'd been here once before, when the mountain spirit committed its body to the earth it lived to protect. I stared at the forest I'd been born to protect. Visions of the fox and the mouse, the owl and the rabbit lying mangled at my father's feet gnawed at the corner of my eyes. I understand now, Father. My voice came out in nearly a whisper. The first light of dawn spilled over the edge of the world, reaching out with delicate fingers to caress the treetops below. I felt its warmth settle on my skin, but it did little to chase away the chill that gripped my mind. The remnants of the dream still lingered, curling like smoke in the recesses of my heart. The specter of my father's ruined form and his flesh, broken and twisted, and his eyes blind with rage, loomed over me. A single bird called out, its voice clear and pure. Others soon followed. Their song began weaving together a gentle greeting to the waking forest. Their melodies floated on the breeze, lifting and falling until the whole woodland hummed with the delicate harmony of the morning's arrival. I turned my gaze to him, my king, my father, his presence solid and whole beside me. He sat bathed in the light of the morning. His glorious mane swayed with the breeze, shimmering like obsidian dust. His emerald eyes stared far below, and I could see that he was deep in thought. There was no trace of the monster I had seen, and yet something in the air around him felt different, charged, like the presence before a storm. Father, I whispered, the word trembling in the space between us. The vision of his jaws stretched impossibly wide, of glistening eyes sunken deep in darkness flashed before my eyes. What I saw, is that what you fear you'll become? He did not answer at first. His gaze was distant, watching the horizon as though it held the answers he sought. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and delicate, like the wind brushing through the canopy. He spoke softly but resolute. The visions you were shown, what did you see? His question hung in the air, beckoning a tale I would rather forget. I breathed deeply as father does and steadied myself. I recounted the details of my dream to him, the darkness, our family, and the memories from the beginning of our home. I told him of our forest and of his ruin. He breathed deeply and then turned to look at me, the glimmer of dawn reflected in his eyes, transforming them into whirlpools of roaring gold. I trust in you, my child. I trust in you to bring me peace when I can no longer find it. Droplets of the morning dew gathered and fell from his eyes, feeding the hungry cliff. Small flowers emerged from where they fell, their petals unfurling like tiny suns. Their scent drifted through the air, and it was sweet and soft, wrapping around me like the quiet embrace of moss-covered roots. Feelings stirred in me, emerging from somewhere deep inside. I felt like a hollowed log of a once mighty tree that still remembers the warmth of the life it once held. The silence that followed was filled only by the symphony of the waking forest. Birds sang their morning hymns, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, whispering secrets only they could understand. Yet, beneath this serene facade, a storm brewed within me, a tempest of fear and anger, sorrow, fighting for dominance. I glanced at my father, his majestic form at once both the meaning of strength and the harbinger of my greatest challenge. The knowledge tore at me, the desire to preserve and protect clashing with the inevitability of my purpose. Why me? I finally asked. It wasn't just about duty anymore. It was about the tearing of my soul between what must be done and what I desperately wished could be different. Father sighed, a sound so laden with the millennia of grief and acceptance that it nearly broke me. Because you, too, are made of this forest, of its past and its future. You hold with you the spirit of every guardian that has walked these paths before you, and just like them, you will rise to meet your fate, however cruel it may seem. I turned away, looking over the vast expanse of trees and mist, and the land that had nurtured me and would one day demand my ultimate sacrifice. My heart ached with a profound love for this place, and a fierce protectiveness surged through me, grounding my resolve. How will I know when it's time? I asked. My father rose to his feet, and he quietly walked away from me across the narrow cliff's edge. You are the only one that will know when it's time, he said while facing away from me. Years slipped by like leaves carried on the swift currents of the river. Each season etched its passage into the land and into my being. I grew in both stature and spirit, my body hardening with maturity and age, and my mind sharpening against the whetstone of wisdom passed down through generations. Slowly, the buds of my youth burgeoned into proud antlers of a prince, branching skyward with the weight and promise of my lineage. Soon, the forest changed with me. The trees thickened, and their branches interlocking in a protective canopy above. Animals, great and small, recognized my passage through the underbrush, nodding their heads in respect and caution. Yet, as I ascended toward the zenith of my destiny, my father succumbed to the twilight of his reign. The vibrant emeralds of his gaze dimmed, veiled by the milky mists of time. His once formidable antlers, emblems of his regal splendor and strength, commenced their melancholy fracture and splinter, relinquishing shards of his storied grandeur with each waning moon. The velvet of his pelt, once dark as the abyssal night, was now speckled with the silver of waning stars. They shone like the embers of a fading fire. He moved slower, conserving the vitality that had once seemed inexhaustible. I watched him, my heart torn between admiration for the life he had led and the creeping dread for the role I would soon have to play. As the years mounted, so too did the signs of his impending madness. His moments of clarity grew rarer, often replaced by distant gazes and hushed words to unseen spirits. The forest's whispers grew louder, a chorus not of welcome but of warning. On a crisp autumn dusk, as the sunset cast the sky in a tapestry of orange and crimson, I discovered him by the river bank, gazing into its vigorous currents as if beholding visions veiled to mortal eyes. His coat caught the twilight's last gleam, and for an ephemeral moment he stood regal and resplendent, a sovereign of a bygone era. "Father," I called out, my voice a stable timber against the tremble of encroaching fears. He turned, his penetrating gaze slicing through the encroaching dusk between us. "It is nearing, isn't it?" His voice was a golem of sorrow and resignation, echoing the fall of the leaves in the silent forest. "Yes, Father," I conceded, the memories of my juvenile self resounding within me. The silence between us, dense and fraught with the echoes of the past, seemed to stretch into eternity. I held his gaze and witnessed his mind slip. I watched as the king lost connection, and I watched the madness wash over him. His teeth then bared in a snarl, a primal display of raw power and imminent collapse. The growl that rumbled from his throat was not just a sound, but a deep, resonant dirge for the end of his era, vibrating through the crisp autumn air. He took a step closer, his movements heavy and uncertain. He seemed to grow, regaining the stature from his past. The forest around us responded by holding its breath for fear of incurring the wrath of its mad king. And my father stood before me, his mighty form casting shadows across the clearing. Each breath that left his nostrils sent a gale of air rippling through the field. His low growl rumbled deep in his chest, the resonance spreading through the ground and reverberating in my spirit. The gray ash of his eyes now blazed with a bright, burning ferocity that made the very sky shudder. And when he charged, it was as if the entire forest moved with him. I braced myself, feeling the weight of his prominence cascading down upon me. His antlers, once the symbols of peace and protection, now carved through the air like twin scythes. I reeled and fell under the first swing, feeling the wind whistle above my ears, and I barely rolled away from the next one as his hooves struck the earth with a ground-shattering force. A deafening roar erupted from him, and there was no recognition in his gaze, only madness and wrath, a primal force unleashed. He lunged again, faster this time, his jaws snapping at my shoulder. I twisted away, but not before the jagged teeth tore through my flesh. Pain flared hot and sharp, and I shoved my father back as I moved away. "Stop, please!" My plea fell on deaf ears as he continued his assault. He was a tempest of rage, a maddened creature beyond reason or remorse. Blow after blow rained down upon me, and I could feel myself weakening, my muscles aching from the sheer effort of avoiding, falling, and enduring. I screamed. A sound like the symphony of thunder and of falling boulder, of crashing waterfall and splintering tree ruptured in the silent forest. And then it happened. A moment of clarity, a sliver of hesitation. He paused, and his head reared back as if fighting against an invisible chain that pulled him to a standstill. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I lunged forward. My claws struck true, sinking deep into his sides. My hands met inside his chest, and I gripped his erratic heart. A deafening roar split the air, and he staggered, but instead I pulled him close. Blood, rich and dark, poured from the wound, soaking into the earth. He struggled and bayed, scratched and tore. and then began to slow and whine. The mad king soon whimpered and swayed, his great frame trembling as he struggled to stay upright. And slowly he turned to look at me, and for a brief, beautiful moment I saw it, the faintest glimmer of recognition. His eyes, once clouded with rage and pain, softened. He slowly and gently placed his soft snout on my forehead, and then spoke his final words. "My cub." And then he fell. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he crumpled to the ground, his massive body collapsing like a mountain. Silence swallowed the clearing, and the vibrant, living pulse of the forest dulled to a heavy stillness. I stood there, panting, my limbs shaking from the exertion and the shock of what I had done. Time became meaningless, and days passed as I remained at his side, watching him. A cold numbness seeped into me, anchoring me to the spot. Grief wrapped around me like the thick roots of ancient trees, binding me to the earth. And soon the forest stirred. One by one, the creatures of the wood began to emerge. Tiny birds fluttered down from the canopy, delicate fawns stepped forth from the underbrush. Even the smallest insects crawled over the moss-covered rocks. They all came, drawn by some unseen force, their eyes reflecting the sorrow that now hung thick in the air. The first bird landed gently on my father's still form. It cocked its head, studying him with something akin to reverence, before it delicately plucked fur from his mane. A fox padded forward next, its nose quivering as it sniffed at his side. With a soft whine, it took a small tuft of fur between its teeth and turned back into the forest with her pups. A bear and an old rabbit then shambled toward him together. The bear lowered its head as it approached his ribs. It looked down at the old rabbit by his side and then back to my father. The bear pulled a loose tuft of his hair and gently dropped it in front of the rabbit. The rabbit took the fur and sauntered out of the clearing. The bear remained and sniffed my father's wounds. I watched as he cleaned the blood from my father's fur and returned to the woods. Slowly, they gathered around him, one by one, each taking a small part, a piece of flesh, a drop of blood, a tuft of hair. No part was taken with malice or hunger. It was a ritual, an act of communion. They consumed him with a gentleness I had never seen in nature before, as if honoring the life he had lived and the power he had wielded. I watched as bit by bit the horned king's body disappeared. His once proud form was returned to the earth and sky through the creatures he had once ruled over. The last to come were the insects, the beetles, and the ants that worked tirelessly until nothing remained but a skeleton, gleaming white in the soft light of dusk. And then, when it was all done, they all withdrew, and the clearing fell silent once more. For a long time I stood alone beside my father's remains, feeling the void of his absence. And yet another night crept in, and still I remained. It was not until the first light of dawn broke through the canopy that I noticed it. A tiny green shoot pushing its way through the soil between his ribs. Slowly, impossibly, it climbed toward the sky. The shoot thickened, its leaves unfurling with each passing hour until it stood as a young sapling. I watched in awe as it continued to grow, Roots delving deep into the soil, branches stretching wide within days, the sapling became a tree, its trunk twisting and turning as it wove itself around my father's skeleton. As the tree grew, it steadily consumed what remained of our king, our father. The bark was a deep, rich brown that shimmered with gold in the evening sun. Leaves of the darkest green, like emeralds, covered the mighty tree's branches. The wind, which came racing along the mountains and caressed the forest, flowed steadily across the leaves. A mighty hemlock now stood where my father had fallen, its roots embracing his bones, holding them tight. The forest seemed to exhale a sigh of relief, a breath of renewal that swept through the trees and stirred the air. And though pain still gripped my heart, I felt a strange sense of peace that settled over me. My father was gone, but he had not left me. He would always be here, in this place of memories and dreams. His essence had returned to the soil, to the sky, and to the very life of the forest. I rose slowly, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders as I turned to leave the clearing. The hemlock stood tall and proud behind me, a guardian of its clearing. I glanced back once, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw him, the outline of his form shimmering in the dappled light, his eyes soft and kind. I breathed deeply, feeling the fortitude of his life. "Rest well, Father," I whispered, and the wind carried my words through the leaves and through the trees and into the endless embrace of the forest. The forest has changed in the long silence that followed that fateful day. The years have crept upon me like the quiet passage of seasons, one flowing effortlessly into the next. Moss and time covered my wounds, and the agony of losing my father, once a sharp-edged torment, has now softened into a distant echo, a note of sorrow carried gently upon the wind. Now I stand beneath the mighty hemlock that rose from his death, its branches a testament to all that was and all that has yet to be. It has been centuries since I saw him fall, since the soil drank his essence and gave birth to this magnificent tree. The roots have sprawled deep and wide, entangling with the roots of other ancient oaks and birches, weaving a subterranean web that whispers secrets that only I can hear. And from this place, this sacred, unchanging glen, I have watched the world shift around me. I was here when the humans first came. At first, they were little more than a curiosity, a stumbling band of creatures who could not read the language of the leaves nor understand the speech of the birds. They moved with an awkward urgency that startled the wildlife and drove them into the deeper recesses of the woods. Yet there was something about them, something resilient and curious that drew me closer. I remember watching them from the shadows, eyes glowing faintly in the night as I observed their strange rituals. They built small, fragile shelters from branches and leaves, huddled together around the warm, flickering light of fire. They ate together, sharing food from the forest that they had worked all day to gather. Years passed and their numbers grew. Soon they felled trees, cutting deep into the flesh of my forest. I seethed at first. A raw, bubbling anger rose within me, and I came close, so very close to driving them out. But something stayed my hand. There was a look in their eyes that reminded me of the creatures of my home, of the fox and the owl, of the rabbit and the mouse, a look of fear and awe and longing, a look that spoke of a deep yearning to understand and to belong. Curiosity quelled my anger, and soon I began to approach them inch by careful inch, until one night a child with the hair the color of dying leaves found me. His wide eyes, full of wonder and innocence, met mine without fear. He stretched out his tiny hand, and I, against all reason, lowered my head. The touch was tentative, light as a moth's wing, yet it burned with an intensity that surprised me. And this was the first bond I forged with a human. The child returned often, babbling words that I could not comprehend, drawing symbols in the dirt that meant nothing to me, but I listened and I watched. I began to see patterns in their speech, shapes in their signs. I learned their tongue, first in halting, broken sounds, and then in smooth, flowing sentences. And in time, I spoke to them, quietly at first, afraid to startle them. They called me many things: a spirit, a guardian, a god, a friend. I called them fragile, fleeting, and impossibly brave. They welcomed me into their village, and there I marveled at the things they built, not just the structures of stone and wood, but the worlds they created within themselves. Stories flowed from their lips like rivers, carrying me to places I'd never been. One night, a young woman sat beside me, a book cradled in her lap. She spoke of letters, of words etched in ashen water that could capture a voice long after it had faded. I listened as she read, her voice weaving a tale that held me captive. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something new stirred deep within me. It was an urge to leave my own mark, to speak of what my life has been. She taught me how to read and write in the still hours of the following nights. My claws, once meant for tearing and climbing, now awkwardly grasped the quill as I scratched out letters on parchment. I fumbled and struggled, but with each stroke a new story was told. Years bled into decades, and still I remained. The child who had first found me grew old and passed into dust, as did his children and theirs after them. But I stayed, seemingly as eternal as the forest around me, watching as human hands shaped and reshaped the land. And now I sit beneath the hemlock tree, my father's tree, quill in hand, parchment spread before me. My fur, once sleek and strong, has become grizzled and weathered, streaked with the silver of countless moons. The hemlock's branches sway gently overhead, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the pages. I write these words a final time to honor what was and what is, to speak of the life I have lived, the beings I have known, the humans I have come to cherish. But they are also something more. They are creators, destroyers, dreamers, and in their stories I have found a reflection of my own. I have watched them rise and fall, seen them weep and laugh and struggle and endure. I have mourned their losses and celebrated their triumphs, and now I set my tail down beside theirs. My forest is quieter now, the voices of the wild less frequent, but there's a new song that fills the air. It's the sound of children's laughter and voices as they tell their own stories under the shade of my father's tree. The hemlock stands tall, its roots intertwined with the bones of the one who gave me life. As I write this, I can almost feel him here beside me, his presence as strong, as comforting as it was all those centuries ago. I am the last of my kind, the lone keeper of this place. I never split my soul to continue the cycle, but through these words I will endure, and perhaps, when I too am gone, someone will read this and remember. They will know that once there was a guardian of the forest who walked among them, who watched and who learned and who loved. And that someone is now you. With you now lies the tale of my father, my forest, and my life. I trust you to bring the world peace, because I have already found mine, my sweet, sweet cub.